Well, I am so glad I found you. I was out here on my own, couldn't find a single place where I could feel at home. I was just amazed to see that you'd been here for so long. I'm grateful that you persevered. I wrote you all this song. I was thinking mango thoughts in a meatloaf town. The food for thought was all the same. It really brought me down. Nothing on the heavenly buffet line was satisfying my appetite for truth and right. I'd sit in here just sighing.
Hello and welcome to the Progressive Redneck Preacher Podcast. I'm your Progressive Redneck Preacher, Micah Royal. For those of you who are new to our program, in each of our podcasts we try to lift up voices that often get overlooked, not heard in our wider world, especially voices here in the South and in small towns across our country of people who are speaking up for issues of social justice, for tearing down walls of division, and for keeping God's earth green, and speaking not despite their faith, despite their connection here in the South or with small towns, but because of it. I don't know about you, but I find a lot of times in the news, on my Facebook feed, the voices of people of faith from here in the South and from small towns across our country tend to be people who use their faith to build walls or to beat people down who are different. But I know so many people whose voices of faith, whose work inspired by their values here in the South and small towns across our country are what inspire them to do such good work. So each podcast I try to talk to someone who can tell their story about how their faith and the faith of others they know are inspiring that sort of good work. And usually these fall into two categories. We have what I call my country fried citizens and also kudzu citizens. Country fried citizens are folks like me who grew up deeply rooted in the South, and because of the values they learned on grandma's knee or sitting down getting their hands dirty in the garden, because of those values, not despite them, they do works of justice. They tear down barriers. They try to make God's earth. But I also like to talk to people that I call kudzu citizens. And driving up and down Eastern North Carolina highways, you see growing on almost every tree in the woods green leafy kudzu. And it seems to be just such a part of the landscape here, but it's not from around here. Kudzu and honeysuckle and many of these features of the southern landscape that we just consider coming home came from elsewhere. And there are people who weren't originally from here but have come to settle in the South and in small towns and call it home and are making the place more beautiful, who come from other places. And we're going to talk to just such a voice today. We're going to talk to my good friend and a longtime activist for social justice and for peace, Chuck Fager. Welcome to our program, Chuck.
Thank you, Micah. Good to be here.
Good to have you. And I was saying that I consider you a kudzu citizen here of the South. You want to tell us a little bit about where you come from?
Well, this time I came in early 2002 to run a Quaker peace project in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is right near Fort Bragg. A peace project which had plenty of work to do, but nobody wanted to go there and be director. They hadn't had a director for a year and a half, and I had been teaching and was laid off, so I was unemployed. And I found I was really pretty competitive for Quaker jobs that nobody else wanted. And so with some assist, I belonged to the Kick in the Head school of Quaker pastoral theology.
Kick in the head.
Kick in the head. I got a kick in the head about coming south after 9/11, and I was out of work. There was this job. Nobody wanted it. I didn't want it. But after 9/11, a peace job. I knew where wars were coming. I felt like an old Army reservist being called up to active duty, and so off I went. And I didn't know how long I'd stay. I didn't expect to stay. But I stayed for 11 years at that particular job till I was old enough to retire. And one day, I wish I knew the day, One day I heard myself say a strange thing. And until then, I had said to lots of people, because I did a lot of traveling in that job, well, down in North Carolina, they do this and they do that. And the strange thing that I heard myself saying one day was, down in North Carolina, we do this and we do that. Oh, my God. And you talk about kudzus. Well, kudzu occurred to me, and I realized North Carolina is kind of like kudzu and mildew. It grows on you. And by the time I was ready to retire, 2012, I had pretty well resolved if I could find a place to stay here, and wound up coming to Durham. It was the bottom of the housing market. Was able to get a pretty good deal on a little house, and I've been here ever since, and I hope not to have to move except maybe in a little box from here. But in the meantime, I've been busy doing various retirement-related stuff.
Well, as a member of the community you just called the bottom of the housing market, I'm glad you're here with us in Durham.
Well, thank you.
You mentioned that this time when you moved to the South, that was because of your work at the Quaker House. And in a minute, I think we'll talk a little bit about some of the things you did some of the first times you lived in the South. But tell us a little bit about the Quaker House. I'm very familiar with it, as you know, but I think that it might be new to some of our listeners who are not familiar with its work.
Sure. Well, Quakers are supposed to be peace-oriented, and some of them are. Some of them aren't. Don't want to give anybody any illusions. And during the Vietnam War, some of the ones who were very concerned about the Vietnam War got together, and a soldier from Fort Bragg came to the Quaker meeting in Chapel Hill and said, gee, I need some help down there. I'm trying to get to be a conscientious objector and nobody will help me. Will you help me? And you know what? There's a lot more people like me down there, and Quakers ought to be down there. And so they got together, scrambled around a lot, and Quakers, when they're faced with an emergency, they react by forming a committee. And and they did, and they formed a committee, and they raised some money, and they found a house to rent down in Fayetteville, and they called it Quaker House. And Quaker House has been there 49 years as we are speaking, so it's almost 50, and they have been busy all that time, and they're plenty busy now, dealing with a variety of issues around folks in and around the military who are having trouble with the military. People who discover that this war business does not fit with their moral and religious values, or who are having trouble by the way they're treated within the military, and also have been subject to various kinds of fallout from being in combat and stuff like that. So there's a range of things that we've been working on, and it varies from time to time. When I was there, when I came, we were getting ready to go to the big wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and those dominated the time that I was there. Now those are still around, but they are less in the foreground, and we're dealing more with secret wars, drones and all that sort of stuff, and things like domestic violence, which is much higher in military communities than civilian communities, and other kinds of issues. So there's still plenty, and of course we're trying to keep an eye open because there's lots of little, relatively small secret wars now these days, but any minute one of them could get to be a big and not so secret war. So my successors down there are still quite busy as each day goes by, even because there's lots of stuff that they see close up that general public largely doesn't.
Thank you. And if I can go back to the kudzu analogy, when I saw you, I knew you when you were working there, and it reminded me a lot of kudzu in a different way. Kudzu is an invasive species, and the Quaker House does such good work, and you did such good work raising these issues of what somebody I interviewed recently called the powers and principalities at work, and war. The war machine is that.
Right.
But like kudzu has become, but like it probably initially was, oftentimes I think the Quaker House was treated as an invasive species. You're not welcome here. We don't want to hear it as a community, even though a lot of work was done. So thank you for your work you did with that.
Sure.
Well, one of the things we like to do here at Progressive Redneck Preacher is to sit down at table together. Because that's a big thing here at the South. Mama used to say, put your feet underneath my table, and when you did that, you knew you were going to be treated like family. And so we sat down and we ate a meal together at the table here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what we ate and why that might connect with your story?
Well, I gather they were hipster collard greens.
Yes.
You got some fancy hipster soul food place. I'm not familiar with that. I am familiar with collard greens, though, and they're pretty good.
Yeah, we got some collard greens from Picnic, which is a barbecue place over here in Durham, and I think they were okay. They were okay, but you had told me a story before about some important collard greens from one of the earlier times you lived in the South or worked in the South.
Yeah, you're referring to a story it's a true story, but it's become the title of a memoir that I've done. It's called Eating Dr. King's Dinner, and it tells the story of my first time really in the South in 1964 to 1966, when I wound up being a very junior member of Dr. King's staff. And in the course of that, I was arrested along with Dr. King and about 250 other folks in Selma, Alabama, the 1st of February 1965. And in the course of the day there, we were all put into jail together, and then the sheriff came and took 4 of us out: Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, who was his right-hand man, and another civil rights worker, and myself. I was considered to be an outside agitator. I was trying to be anyway. I was still a rookie and very green and new to the South, and I was not much of a danger to the system of white supremacy in the South at the time, but I wanted to be, and so they lumped me in with them, and they took the 4 of us and put us in another part of the jail in a small cell, all 4. And later in the day of that morning when I got up, I knew we were going to try to get arrested, and I was all worked up about it and wasn't able to eat any breakfast, just too nervous and stuff, and ended up in this jail cell late in the afternoon, hadn't had anything to eat all day, and was really hungry. And Dr. King took a nap, and just sort of sitting there twiddling my thumbs and sitting there doing nothing, hour after hour. You get to focus on things like an empty stomach, and I felt really famished. And eventually a trustee came down the aisle in this jail little cell block, and he had 1 plate of collard greens on a little cart, and he said this was dinner for Dr. King. And oh gosh, those collard greens look so good. Although I have to say, until then I hadn't liked collard greens, so this was like one of these instantaneous conversions,
Right.
The lightning strikes, and they kick you off your donkey and on the road to Damascus. And
it's amazing what exhaustion, boredom, and hunger will
That's
do.
right. They all of a sudden those collard greens smell so good and they look so good, but he said, no, this is for Dr. King, and there was just 1 plate. So anyway, Dr. King got up and talked with the fella, a trustee, an old black fella, who probably spent most of his time in jail, but he must have been some kind of petty criminal, but not necessarily a real danger, because they let him work in the kitchen where there's knives and stuff. And here comes Dr. Martin Luther King into his little pretty restricted world, and he wants to do something special for him, so he does what he knows how to do, make them. And so he brings this plate of collard greens down there, and Dr. King comes to the bars, and I was totally focused on the collard greens and their wonderful aroma and how green they looked. Oh gosh! And I didn't hear.
For folks who don't know, collard greens smell to high heaven.
Oh, yes.
My partner tells me that her grandmother used to have a collard club where they would go to each other's houses to cook the collards, so they could then eat them somewhere else and not smell them.
Well, I didn't mind the smell that day for sure, and but then I wasn't paying attention to what Dr. King was saying to the fellow because I was so transfixed by the greens. But then Dr. King told him that he wasn't going to eat the greens, and the fellow said, "What?" And I said, "What?" And Dr. King explained that he had gone to India after their first movement in Montgomery in 1955 to study the work of Mahatma Gandhi. And they found that he worked very hard when he was imprisoned, especially if he was in prison with other people, to make the time count by doing all sorts of practical things. And they were practical things of learning and teaching, but also religious things, trying to keep religions in India from fighting. And Dr. King said they were very impressed by this, and he and Abernathy talked about how to adapt what they were learning to the situation in the U.S., where they expected they'd probably be in jail from time to time. And they decided to try to make their time in jail kind of a spiritual retreat. And as part of that discipline, when they went to jail for the first 2 days, they fasted. So he couldn't eat the collard greens because he was expected to be in jail for a while, and so they were going into this discipline. Well, I didn't know anything about this.
You had not had a religious conversion yet about fasting.
That's right. I had one about collard greens, but I hadn't one about fasting. And now Dr. King, I regarded him as like my commander in a nonviolent army. If he had said, "Oh, hey, we're all in this together," yes, sir, no problem. But he didn't say that. He just said he couldn't eat them. And the poor fellow, the trusty guy, he looked around, and all the other 3 people all said, yeah, well, they weren't going to eat any. And then finally he looked at me. And I like to say that my heart was moved with compassion, like the fellow in the parable of the Good Samaritan, And I said, if it wasn't my heart that was moved by compassion, it was an organ that wasn't far away, just a little bit further down. And I said to the guy, look, I haven't heard about any of this stuff before, and if it's okay with Dr. King, I'd hate to see you go away, not empty-handed, and so if it's all right, I'll eat your greens if nobody else will. And
so you made the sacrifice.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And Dr. King nodded. That's right. He wasn't asking me to join, and the others didn't want it, but they were joining, so they didn't do it. So he passed in the plate, and I ate it all, except he gave me a plastic fork, so I couldn't make a weapon out of it, and stuck it in the collard greens, and it went in a little ways, and then stops on something hard, and I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is this some kind of a trick? Lifted it up, and turns out the collard greens were kind of a cover story, and what was under them were 2 big, thick, wonderful pieces of Alabama country ham, and I ate every bit of it. Oh my goodness. I cleaned it. I turned away from Dr. King. I was so hungry, and I was embarrassed to be gobbling the stuff down right in his face. But I did gobble it down. And I like to say that meal has fed me for 50-some years now, and I certainly learned a lot. I was in jail that night, and then the next day they got me out. I needed to go back to work. Dr. King stayed in jail for several more days. So that was... yes, indeed, my conversion experience about collard greens. I can't say I eat them all the time here now, but nonetheless, I gobbled it down tonight.
Right, but unfortunately, there wasn't the giant piece of meat on the
That's
bottom.
Right. That's okay. That's okay.
I love what you said there, that you ate that meal and it's been nourishing you ever since. Because one of the things I was hoping to talk about was some of the work you've been doing lately has been about these sort of practices. Some of them existed before Dr. King's movement and some after. These practices of resistance that people of faith have engaged in times of injustice, when there's systems of oppression. I find a lot of folks are overwhelmed right now at this climate. Like, it's a new thing that there's racism and sexism and intolerance that's holding sway, but that was not a new thing to Dr. King, and it's not a new thing to the story of faith. And you're doing a lot of work around the stories of resistance, and I know I'm thinking of both a journal and also a center down in Alamance County you do some work with. And I wonder if you tell us a little bit about that work around those stories.
Well, see, Quakers have been around for 370 years or so, and while a lot of Quakers were and are rather ordinary people, and some of them are not necessarily even progressive-minded, nonetheless, there was a lot of persecution of Quakers in the early days, and also there were Quakers, not necessarily all of them, but there were Quakers who became concerned about various issues, like, for instance, slavery, and later the rights of women, and lots of other issues, and were active, and not only just active in advocating things, but in various ways they undertook various forms of nonviolent kinds of resistance to forms of oppression they encountered personally and that they encountered on behalf of other people. So, and again, it wasn't everybody, but there's sort of been an apostolic succession that goes pretty much all the way back to the beginning of our movement, and some very remarkable people are in that number. My personal favorite, really, of many, is Lucretia Mott, who was an advocate for abolition of slavery, for advancing the rights of women, for prison reform, for a whole bunch of other issues, while she was raising 6 kids and having a very busy home life. I mean, I feel like such a slacker when I read her letters from the 1830s and 1840s when she was cultivating a garden and raising kids and entertaining all sorts of visitors and reading books and magazines and going to meetings and speaking. She was also a speaker, a pioneering woman speaker in a time when women weren't supposed to speak in public. And I just think, how did she do all this? And she was just had lots of energy, and she was serious about her values. She wasn't just bouncing along from one thing to another. And so anyway, she's one that's special to me, but there are lots of others. And I've read about these people. I've known a few of these people who are, some of them are still with us and some of us are not, some of them are not. And I've been a writer all along here. That's been sort of my occupation. And I knew narrative theology when it wasn't cool. I mean, stories, okay? Stories are where it's at, especially in religion. And also in social change, social justice work. So I've been interested in finding and retrieving some of these stories. I retrieved some stories that were covered over by the dust of history. And then I've worked on collected some from my time. I've been among Quakers for 52 years, and some of these stories of people that I knew or people that I knew of who were still alive when I was around, and tried to get them together. I published a collection on Quakers and resistance just in the last month. It's part of a journal called Quaker Theology, and you can Google Quaker Theology and you can read it or you can order it from Amazon. And this is by no means comprehensive, but 260 pages worth of samples of work that people had done in various times, in various ways. Quakers, we're kind of communitarian in a way, but we're also very individualistic. We most of us anyway believe that that God works through us in ways that are both concerned for our communities, but also concerned for us. And so I might want to do one sort of thing like writing. Somebody else might want to be building. Somebody else might be community organizing. And it's good if we can all work together, but we don't have to. We can still be animated by the same spirit and be part of the same community. So in my old age now, I'm 75, my feeling is that when people get to be this age, one of the main tasks is to collect and tell and pass on the important stories that constitute what our faith is in the world. In fact, I was going to say in action, but it doesn't always have to be in action. It can also be in contemplation and rest. I have a friend who is an activist, and part of his activism is to help activists learn how to chill out.
Right.
So, as I say, there's a lot of opportunities, and if one thing doesn't work out, or you get finished with one thing, you can regroup and be led to do something else. So, but now I've paid a lot of attention to collecting and passing on, for preserving the stories I think are important. Because, in fact, here's a little bit of a story. This is fiction, but I have had times when I felt like I could sort of imagine myself, or at least imagine myself imagining myself, being a black man of my age in Durham, North Carolina, a little farm village, say in about 1800. And say I was 75, which I am now. And I have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and a great-granddaughter. And my parents were gone, but I can remember them, and I can remember my grandparents. So I stand kind of in the middle there of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. They are alive in my memory or my experience. My children, grandchildren, and great-granddaughter are, living, and I can go see them. My parents, grandparents are gone, but I remember them. And anyway, so if I was 18, a black man, 75, Durham, 1800, and I had grandparents that I could remember, parents that I could remember, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, looking at them, they would all have been slaves. or worse, would-be slaves. 5 generations of slaves. And 1800, there was no abolitionist movement.
Right.
There were a few people, like some Quakers, who believed in freeing slaves, or here and there, but there wasn't a big movement. And as far as I can imagine, that 5 generations of slavery that would be part of my living experience, there's no end to it in sight. Not for me. No end to it. I mean, maybe my grandchildren, and great-granddaughter would live to be free in 1860, but I wouldn't be around then. And we didn't hear about that wasn't on this horizon then. So anyway, and I think to myself, if I was in a position like that, how would I get through? How would I survive? How would I bear up?
Yeah.
How would I endure? And I don't know the answer how I would do it, but I know a little bit about what people of color and the slave people did. They invented spirituals.
Right.
They invented ways to get through. I mean, certainly there was a great deal of pain, a great deal of oppression, and people paid a terrible cost. But there's still plenty of people of color around, and they have stuff that came out of that. And I have to say that, like, for instance, the spirituals, I believe that's American classical music. It's as important as any of the classical music I've heard since then. I'm a classical music fan. So, and other kinds of culture, the blues and storytelling. Lots and lots of things. There were things that they did to survive, give them their lives some kind of meaning. And I don't understand them all, but I know that they did it. And I have to say, looking around today, I begin to think more and more that learning how to do that may be more and more important to us, because I believe we're in a terrible fix, and we're not going to get out of it just because one party does better in the next election than it did last time. I think, in fact, when I went down to Selma in 1965 to work with Dr. King's organization, I was young. It was kind of like coming into one of these superhero movies in the last 15 minutes, where you get the big fight and the big pyrotechnics and the big special effects boom climax, and it was great. But there were people there, old people, who had been laboring under this particular system there. We were talking about exclusion from the right to vote. They had been laboring under that disability for 65 years, 3 generations. Yeah. 65 years. And their vision and experience of it was obviously very different from mine. And I got there as soon as I could, but I was just a kid, really. Right. But still, this kind of stuff can last a long time. My hero, Lucretia Mott, she worked for the abolition of slavery herself for about 45 years. And she lived to see the end of legal slavery, not the end of racism, but Civil War and the end of legal slavery. 40 years. And Quakers had been working against slavery for 50 or so years before she came along. And that's almost 100 years. So 100 years of work. That's 4 generations, 4 or 5, depending on how you calculate it. And she worked to advance the rights of women for 50 years, really, till she died in 1880. And women didn't get the vote for 40 more years of that. So 50 years, 40 years, that's another close to 100 years effort. And of course, that wasn't getting the right to vote wasn't the end of things either. So big struggles go on a long time. And how do you bear up under that? And Lucretia Mott was white. She was never a slave, but hey, she was a woman. She couldn't vote. And she still managed. She and a relatively small group of her fellow women's rights activists, they managed to raise holy hell without ever casting a vote, because they weren't allowed to. And I think sometimes we've completely forgotten that. Everything is an election. Everything is the next election. And, there are other ways to raise hell and change society. And maybe we need to begin to learn some of those things, because I think many of the things that are underway today are designed to diminish and dilute the meaning of the forms of democracy. And I don't know whether that's going to, like I say, I'm going to vote, and I'm probably going to be involved in campaigns in one way or another this next go around. But at the same time, we got to have, ideas and plans, and particularly stories that can get us through, if, as I think is likely, it takes a long time to get us out of the mess we're in now. So
There's a powerful story there about Lucretia Mott, and thinking about new and different ways that her story calls us to interact, and also the stories of people who were experiencing slavery. Do you have any other stories of resistance that stand out to you that speak to our situation?
Well, I'm very much involved in a project down in Alamance County called the Snow Camp Outdoor Theater, and that was one that was started 45 years ago by some folks down there who put together 2 plays that were largely inspired by Quaker history from that area. Quaker's been there a long time. And one of them deals with the American Revolution, and the other one deals with the Underground Railroad and slavery. And now they're a mix of fact and fiction, but because there's real history about those things there. But they're also dramas. And I've seen the plays performed, and I was in the cast for the one about the Underground Railroad last summer. And I think those stories are really very important. And I think the reaction of folks who came to see them was an indication of that. And so those kinds of stories, and there are others too. One of the stories that's just beginning to surface around here, and I'm working on it, is the stories of lynchings. There's a project out of Alabama that's developed a pretty thorough compilation of records about that, and according to their records, there were 124 black folks who were lynched in North Carolina between the Civil War and, 1940 or 1950. And 2 of them were in Alamance County, which is where this play is. And the 2 stories there, they're horrible stories. They're not the most horrible lynching stories, but they're horrible stories anyway. And maybe some way, I'd like to find some way to lift up those stories. Those people were not tried and convicted of anything. They were victims of publicly sanctioned terrorism.
Yeah.
I call it sort of the first big war on terrorism, at least in the South, and the terrorists won that one.
Yeah.
So thinking of, I'm still working on this, but some way to bring that piece of history out of the shadows. It's recorded. You can find it if you dig into libraries and stuff, but I'm talking about if we're going to have statues in front of the courthouse, how about the one of the black man who was lynched right near the courthouse?
That's right.
And others, and as I say, 124 in North Carolina. And the total that they have come up with is several thousand. And there's pictures of them, where big crowds were gathered and they were celebrating. It's just awful to read and to look at and try to take in. And I think this is sort of white people's work. So I hope that I get a chance to figure out something that relates to that. And there are lots of opportunities for other people around North Carolina because there's 122 more very different places that ought to be remembered. If you're going to put up statues, by golly, there ought to be statues to these people. So that's sort of looking forward, looking ahead. But I believe that getting those stories told and in the public changes things. It changes the public mind and changes the public's consciousness. I don't know exactly what's going to happen then. I don't have a very elaborate plan, but those stories are important to people. They really are. And so I'm hoping to figure out ways to help tell them. And that's one project. There were others. There was a fellow from Arizona named Jim Corbett who was a goat herder. He was kind of a failed librarian. He'd been to college and whatnot, and I think he was a troublemaker. And he wound up living in a trailer out in the middle of the desert, the Sonoran Desert, near the Mexican border in Arizona. And he had goats, and he'd wander around the desert with goats. And he came in the early 1980s. He came across some refugees from the Central American wars that the Reagan administration was bankrolling, and lots of people were running for their lives and running across the desert. And he found some folks doing that, and he made a mistake. He took them to the immigration folks and said, "These are supposed to help you, so they'll help you." Bad move.
Oh.
He didn't know any better.
Yeah.
And he went back the next day to see what they were doing and see how he could help, and they were gone. They'd been deported already.
Oh, my.
And so he learned from his mistake, and pretty soon he had become basically the founding the founder of what was then called the sanctuary movement. Started out in the Southwest and spread across the country, and it was a movement, an anarchist grassroots movement, mostly based in churches, synagogues, and stuff, where people helped folks get away from the border and find places to land. Some of them went all the way to Canada, and the government came after them. They tried to put Jim Corbett in jail, and they didn't succeed, but they did a few others, and they were really kind of fought to a standstill by this movement. And it's a great story, and unfortunately some of it's been written down, but it's not really well known now or well remembered, but still it's there. And I don't know exactly. I mean, I've put his story between covers in my journal and try to spread it around. There could be more ways to do that, and
that's a story we're certainly talking about. You know, I've had a few people on my podcast who are part of the movement, trying to reinvigorate the sanctuary movement and rethink it, because we still have this problem.
Yes,
with people.
Yes, we still have the problem. And I have to say, one of the things I tell people when I tell them the story about eating Dr. King's dinner and my work in Selma, Alabama, and the voting rights movement there, I hope that these stories inspire people and inform people, but they're not blueprints. Right. And it's not. I don't expect people to do the same thing that we did, because it's 50 some years later since we were in Selma. The situation is different in lots of ways. Media is different. Culture has changed, and so you can learn from what we did. But I don't think you're really going to try to end up doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. Circumstances are different, and so be inspired by it and informed. You got to be creative. I will say one thing that abides is that the smart folks, like Jim Corbett, were creative and imaginative. So that abides. So people got to be creative and imaginative today to figure out stuff. I'm not sure that I'm not a specialist on this, but I'm not so sure that the stuff that they did in the 80s for the sanctuary movement, I'm not sure that's going to work so well this time.
Right.
I don't have a recipe for how to make things better, because it's not been my specialty. But the fact is that they had a good time and considerable success doing things in a set of ways in the 1980s may not be the same for 2018 and years to come. But they do need to figure to raise hell. I commend them in doing that, creatively, imaginatively, and
well, in those stories, as you said, they inspire. A mom of 6 who gardens, raising hell and tearing down injustice about slavery. Failed librarian who's a goat herder.
Right.
I mean, who would expect?
Right. And I think that that's important, because nowadays we have a media consciousness, I have to say, for most of us, and our attention, that media wants us to fix our attention like on Washington. Everything important happens in Washington. Congress politics, the White House, everything important happens there. You know what? An awful lot of important stuff happens outside that. Yeah, we can't do without Congress. We got to get Congress to stop screwing things up. But still, the sanctuary movement came from way far away in the southwestern desert.
Yeah.
And Lucretia Mott, she helped organize the very first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. She and other women, half a dozen other women, and they raised hell in this country, and none of them could vote.
Yeah.
So they raised hell without voting. They had to figure out other ways to do it, and they did. And so let's not be enslaved and transfixed and hypnotized by everything being focused on Washington. After all, there's something like, I just saw a figure the other day, 11,000 lobbyists most of the time in D.C. Well, and they got billions of dollars to play with. Maybe that's not our league. Maybe that's not our league. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is not the league for lots of us. That there are places, other places. Quaker House has been doing work with soldiers needing to get out of the military for almost 50 years. And they got plenty more work to do. I wish there were other places like it, because there's lots more military bases. But they have made their mark, in my opinion. They've made their mark. Unfortunately, the wars still go on, so they haven't succeeded in their ultimate goal. But they've got plenty of stuff to point to that has been productive and useful. And there are other projects like that. And And they don't lobby because they're not in Washington. Other people can lobby. They do work for peace in the jaws of the war machine, where the rubber meets the road. And there's lots of opportunities. What did the man say? The fields are white with the harvest, but the laborers are few. That's right. There's lots of opportunities for people with imagination and a burning fire to get something done. And so you're going to try things. Some of it's not going to work. That's okay. Learn from your mistakes. Keep on pushing. And study your story. Hear your stories. Tell the stories. Perform the stories. Pass them on, because it may be that none of the stuff that you do or I do is going to work, but maybe that your kids are going to pick up and do it. And one of the many things I like about Lucretia Mott, she worked on women's rights for a long time, but I've seen letters of hers to other mothers of the movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where she says, this is a paraphrase, she says, "Have you seen these new young women coming on?
Yeah.
They're really exciting, some of them, and they got real leadership potential. And you know what? The time is coming when our generation, we're going to need to step back and get out of their way. Because we're getting old and there's new stuff coming." And I think that's pretty remarkable that she had that perspective where she was clearly passionate about her issues and her actions, but she also knew that time passes and young people become old people, and new young people come along, and you got to pass the torch. And she was quite willing to do that. And that's really, I think, the phase where I'm in now. Really looking to pass the torch, and also people light new kinds of fires with it. So this is. I don't want to be too upbeat here, because I'm not real upbeat. I'm real nervous about where we're at. I think we're in a heck of a mess.
Right.
And I don't see the cavalry coming riding over the hill to chase all the bad guys away, not right away. And so the task of enduring is one I think deserves more attention. And I hope it gets it. And I've been trying to make my contribution to it with stories, true stories and fictional stories too. I've written a bunch of Quaker stories for young people they're fiction, but they relate to history. And I'm hoping that some of those will speak to some kids and give them ideas that they can build on. And then they can write some new stories too.
I like that challenge, both to hear the story that come and to write our own story. And I think that's a very powerful thing to think about right now. I think about people like William Barber and some of the other folks with his movement, who in some ways they're taking up the baton of the civil rights movement. The work wasn't finished, and I think that's a problem I think some of us have had in the South, especially white folks. I think some of our friends or people of color weren't at all surprised to find out we weren't done. But I think some people think we arrived. We arrived. We've got the right to vote. We had a black president for a while, but the work isn't done, and we're being woken up to that.
Yes, and there's, for me at least, there's more to it than that, because my story about eating Dr. King's dinner, I told it for almost 50 years to various people in print and as well as speaking, and it had a happy ending. The movement there succeeded. The Voting Rights Act got passed. Millions of people of color got to vote. They made a big difference. There were 3 presidents, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. None of them were perfect, but they were all better than some of the others we've seen.
Right.
And those presidencies were made possible by the work that was done in Selma that I had a tiny part in. And I was proud of that, and that was a happy ending. And then along comes the Supreme Court about 3 years ago, and it tears a big hole in the Voting Rights Act. And the legislature of North Carolina and other states is tearing holes in the ability of people to make use of the vote. and gerrymandering and so on and so forth, and they've taken my happy ending away.
Yeah.
And it's not over, but they are pushing us backwards as fast as they can. And so I say to especially young people to tell the story to, I'm happy to tell you the story, but I'm ticked off that they took my happy ending away. But it's a clue here. It's ringing like a bell in the night. It means that the job isn't finished. And now, folks, it's your turn.
Yeah.
It's your turn. And I wish you well. I wish you imagination and determination, and make the most of it, because I think you're going to need to.
Well, I think that's a good challenge to end our program on. And thank you, Chuck, for joining us.
Sure.
Mango thoughts in this meatloaf town. Now my soul is on a roll. I got you folks all around. We got us a feast for the spirit and a feast for the mind. We speak the truth, walk in love. We remember to be kind. Well, that's what the ending would be if I were a sweet and earnest person. And Lord knows I do try. But here's the real ending. We got us a feast for the spirit and a feast for the mind. But in case of rapture, pack a snack, 'cause we'll be left behind.